Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Diane Baden, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. We are pleased to present this webinar in our series on RDA, Resource Description and Access. Our presenter is Christopher Cronin, Director of Metadata and Cataloging Services at the University of Chicago Library. Prior to going to Chicago, he was Assistant Professor and Head of Digital Resources Cataloging at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Chris is a member of the ALA Committee on Organization and is active in ALCTS, currently serving on the Subject Analysis Committee and as Vice Chair, Chair-elect of the ALCTS Heads of Cataloging Interest Group. He is the coordinator for the University of Chicago's participation in the U.S. National Libraries RDA testing. During the webinar, if you have questions for Chris, please type them into the questions box on your screen. Chris will leave time at the end to respond to as many as possible. Please note that we are recording the webinar and you will receive an email with the slides and a link to the recording. And now I will turn the program over to Chris. There will be a slight pause as we change presenters.
Thank you, Diane, for that introduction, and thank you to all of the participants for your interest in today's session. For the purposes of this webinar, I have defined administrators very broadly. I know that participants in this webinar will be coming from all types and sizes of libraries where organizational structures may not reflect the kind of environment that I am in, which is a large research academic library. So I am defining administrators very simply as anyone who makes decisions or is involved in making decisions about cataloging and technical services policies. This ALCTS webinar will attempt to address, from the perspectives of managers and decision makers, some of the major issues related to adopting the new cataloging code, including an overview of the testing process and of the institutions involved in the testing, managing and organizing training for staff, implications of RDA on policies and procedures for cataloging, preparing our ILSs for RDA metadata, managing the integration of RDA and AACR2 records and their displays in the catalog, managing the impact on vended authority control and contract cataloging, and the bottom line, of course, the costs of implementing the new code. The primary goal of the webinar today will be to outline some of the major issues and operational areas that administrators, cataloging managers, public services, and systems staff will want to think about when planning to implement. To this end, RDA will largely, the webinar will largely assume that a decision has been made locally to adopt RDA, not necessarily now, but in the future. I'm getting an email or note here that there's some audio issues. Can people hear me? We're just checking to see. I can't tell if people can hear me, so if the organizers can tell me. Okay, good. Thank you. So to this end, the webinar will largely assume that a decision has been made to locally adopt RDA, and that could be now, that could be 3 months from now, that could be a year from now. It really doesn't matter. I think some of the things that we will talk about will be just as relevant later as they are right now. What the webinar will not talk about really are the kind of relative merits of RDA, its pros and its cons, nor will the webinar serve as a forum for instruction on how to apply RDA rules or concepts. There have already been numerous and excellent presentations on the differences between AACR2 and RDA, and I'll refer to some of the additional resources that you might want to take a look at the end of the webinar. Instead, we will focus on what administrators specifically will need to consider when implementing RDA. And I will occasionally draw on experiences we have had at Chicago, but the ultimate goal of the webinar will be to provide some practical and generalizable context for how anyone might want to approach implementation. So what will the testing process entail? And I'm going to go through this just because I think people are at various stages of understanding what will be involved in the testing process, and by extension what the whole U.S. cataloging community might be able to learn from it. The timeline itself was formalized at a meeting of all of the testing institutions at ALA Midwinter back in January 2010. And at the time we were planning for a release of RDA around June 2010, which thankfully it was. And we decided that before starting the test itself that we would spend 3 months at all of our institutions to acquire the RDA Toolkit, learn how to navigate through the rules, engage in local training, establish local policies and procedures for the test, and the like. The Library of Congress also provided us with a session called Train the Trainers, and they did that at Midwinter, and it was video recorded, and the Library of Congress has very kindly put those on their website along with all of the PowerPoint presentations that really anyone can use. Following the practice period, the official testing began a couple of weeks ago on October the 1st and will continue through the end of the calendar year. All institutions will be cataloging the same 30 resources. 25 of those will require original cataloging and 5 will require copy cataloging. And we will produce both an AACR2 version and an RDA record for each of those resources. And this is what is being called the common set part of the testing. And it will ultimately be used to compare the two codes as well as the processes for how institutions created the records for the same resources. It's essentially an artificial control group. In addition to this common set, each institution will also create a minimum of 25 additional RDA records describing resources of their choosing, and these are called the extra set. And it's to be expected actually that most institutions in the test will do more than 25. Every time one of the catalogers in the test creates an RDA record, they will also complete a rather lengthy survey, actually, that was developed by the Library of Congress, the National Library of Medicine, and the National Agricultural Library to assess how much time it was taking for catalogers to create the records, how much time was spent consulting with others during the cataloging process, difficulties encountered in the test during the testing process, whether that was navigating through the toolkit or interpreting the rules or choosing between options in RDA or applying the coding in some of our communication formats like MARC or MODS or Dublin Core, etc. We'll also be in those surveys talking about any associated authority work that we needed to do if we're at an institution that creates authority records, and any associated difficulties with that process. And it's hoped that over the 3 months we'll be able to gauge differences from the beginning of the test period and the end of it. Toward the end of the testing period in December, each of the catalogers involved will submit a survey of their own that highlights what their own cataloging background is, their experience, what RDA training they've received, as well as their own overall opinions of RDA, and whether they feel it should ultimately be adopted by the U.S. community. The testing coordinators at each institution will also complete a kind of overarching survey of the 3 months period and what our impressions were. And finally, before the end of December, testing institutions will also be required to engage in some level of user testing of RDAs. And users can be defined in this process as either non-cataloging staff in the library, like in acquisitions or circulation or ILL or reference, But they can also be patrons, students, faculty, researchers, the public at large, etc. And we will all really design our own user assessment processes that suit our own needs in our institutions and our staffing abilities, etc. Hopefully that will give us some more information from the user perspective. We will also get copies of all of the surveys that our institutions submit probably in the new year after the end of the testing, and then the national libraries will start to perform their data analysis for the 3 months following the test through the end of March. And it is hoped that the aggregated data about the records produced and the results of the surveys that each cataloger filled out will be made available to the wider community by the national libraries, and that especially the trends that are identified, the major issues or concerns will be highlighted in some way. Testing institutions represent a wide spectrum of institution types, areas of expertise, types of cataloging or metadata production. Beyond the 3 national libraries, the institutions range from large and medium academic libraries to public and school libraries, special libraries. There's one historical society. There are a couple of vendors. There's also a subgroup of library school students and educators, as well as some consortia of professional organizations. Institutions in the test will be producing and contributing to the test bed metadata in a variety of formats and standards. We'll be producing MARC 21, MARC XML, MODS, MADS, and Dublin Core. Some will be creating both bibliographic and authority records. Others will focus solely on bibliographic data. And this is really stemming largely from the fact that the test is structured in a way where our normal processes aren't really supposed to be subverted just to accommodate the testing. That if we don't normally do authority records in our institutions, that's okay. Some will follow PCC standards in addition to RDA, some will not, and there are a variety of ILS systems and faceted browsers represented by the institutions in the test, from Horizon and Unicorn and Symphony, Aleph, III Millennium, Voyager, TLC, WorldCat Local, Blacklight, Aqua Browser, Endeca, and Primo. And those are the major ones as I read through the list that I wanted to mention, because I know many of you listening have those systems, and you may want to contact colleagues who are in the test also using those systems. Some institutions will be doing all of their cataloging directly in OCLC Connection. We will be creating master records, as it were, and others will be working solely in their local databases. Again, largely a reflection of how we already do our work. The national libraries have also invited any non-formal testing institutions to contribute RDA metadata that they create on their own for inclusion in the national testbed of RDA records. The Continuing Resources Cataloging Committee, for example, recently held a webinar, I think last week, about how non-testing institutions could contribute informally to the test process. And I mention all of this because as you consider your own local testing or implementation, it will be important for you all to learn from colleagues, particularly those at similar institutions or who are using similar systems or who create similar types of data. What worked for them, what did not, what lessons can you learn from them in advance of your own implementation? And equally important will be for testers to share widely their own experiences and their best advice to colleagues at other institutions. Many of us are giving conference presentations and training seminars, and we're writing about our experiences on listservs, and I think in the months to come, testing institutions will just be further encouraged to continue sharing their experiences. Most testers are taking one of 2 approaches to testing, and this may prove influential or at the very least interesting down the road for other institutions as they consider how to adopt RDA. Some of the testers are creating smaller groups or subsets of cataloging staff to be RDA testers, while remaining staff continue to use existing processes, workflows, and cataloging rules. Other institutions have decided to shift all of their operations to RDA for the duration of the test. And there are really pros and cons, as with everything, to both of these approaches. Starting small at your institution or with a subset of staff allows an institution to minimize risk, minimize the effects of slower processing that necessarily will accompany the learning curve of adopting new rules or practices. If the institution's test experience results in a decision not to adopt RDA, fewer staff will have been affected. A smaller testing team is also easier to manage and to train, and lessons learned from their experiences could improve the transition to RDA for other catalogers if it is adopted. Fewer records would be produced, which means less impact on review and quality measures, and the impact on the system would be smaller because, of course, fewer RDA's records will have been integrated into the database. On the downside, if RDA is adopted, there will necessarily be a kind of duplication of training and review efforts, and it might be difficult to judge the effects of full-scale production mode across an entire organization if the original subset of catalogers or the resources that you're cataloging aren't representative of the whole. Implementing RDA across an entire organization all at the same time has a number of advantages. Training programs need only to be developed once, and everyone is kind of in it together. It avoids the possibility of creating that sense of a privileged few who get to be a part of something new, something that they're testing, with others who are left behind to kind of pick up their slack and keep up production levels. It has the potential for creating some organization-wide team building. Everyone would have an opportunity to contribute to the process, learn from one another at the same time. But again, the risk is higher, especially if implementing RDA before the national libraries complete their test and make final decisions on adoption. The need for consultation will increase, and certainly the management team will also need to expect a higher volume of questions from staff about how to do the work that they're doing. Policies and procedures will be a little bit more difficult to change in a flexible way if all the staff are using them. Implementing with everyone at the same time will necessarily mean a period when processing times are slower as catalogers learn and apply the new rules and procedures. Ultimately, managers and administrators will have to assess the needs and goals of their own organizations when making the decision on how to implement RDA. How might local organizational culture influence one approach over another? How might RDA implementation contribute to changing or improving organizational culture in some way? How can the process of implementing RDA be used as an opportunity to positively impact professional development? Are there leaders or catalogers with leadership potential who can play a coordinating role? For example, can a cataloger who may not be a supervisor but who has leadership potential and expertise in a certain area take the lead on something like creating RDA authorities and be kind of the go-to person for staff on that? What local, regional, or national training and professional development opportunities will be developed in the next few months? What will be appropriate for your staff, and what will be affordable? Answers to all of these questions will be crucial in weighing your options. At Chicago, we have chosen the approach of involving all catalogers from all cataloging units across the entire system. And so this means that central cataloging, the law library, the maps collection, our CJK collection, and special collections and archival collections, media and music, and digital resources will all be represented in the test, as are both original and copy cataloging. And so far, I think our experience has been extremely positive. We have a highly decentralized cataloging environment, and catalogers who are kind of in charge of specific domains have found new reasons to engage with one another, debate issues, come to resolution, and rely on each other as colleagues in, I think, a different way than they had before. But we don't adopt new cataloging rules just to forge new relationships between catalogers. Ultimately, an institution should be doing this because there is both a belief and evidence that the new rules represent an improved experience for our users and our ability as libraries to manage the data and the resources that we steward. Evidence in these regards may take some time to compile as we create a critical mass of RDA metadata against which to test things like the FRBR user tasks, for instance. And at this stage, implementing RDA is, in truth, kind of an unproven risk. Once an institution decides to implement RDA, certainly one of the first steps will need to be for planning training. In speaking with some of my colleagues at other testing institutions, I think one of the main trends in all of our approaches over this past summer was to start with some kind of introduction to the functional requirements for bibliographic records, or FRBR or FRBR. FRBR is the conceptual model that forms the backbone of the RDA content standard. RDA is organized and structured around FRBR, and it uses the same terminology. At minimum, an introduction to FRBR concepts will be important and should probably preface RDA training. Similarly, but perhaps more important for organizations that perform original authority work, a knowledge of FRBR's cousin for authorities, the Functional Requirements for Authority Data, or FRAD, may also be important. The Library of Congress and Dr. Barbara Tillett in particular have been excellent about sharing some of their tutorials and introductory presentations on FRBR, which I know that several of the testing institutions also used, including a presentation on FRBR that was held at LC last year that was actually intended for an audience of non-catalogers. That is really good. At Chicago, our original catalogers have been familiar with FRBR for quite some time, have been discussing it in their cataloging forum group since its original publication. But copy catalogers may have heard of it peripherally, but they hadn't really looked at it in detail and weren't as well versed in its structure or its purpose. So starting with an introduction to FRBR concepts and terminology gave them a context for the organization of the new code. And I'm providing, at the end of the webinar, I've provided a slide with some links to training resources that you might want to look at. In terms of time management, unless you have an in-house expert on FRBR, managers should take advantage of training resources that exist elsewhere to the extent possible, modifying and supplementing them for local needs, but not starting from scratch when you don't really need to. And I believe there are some ALCTS webinars coming up in the coming weeks that might also be of interest. Training on RDA itself will necessarily be a phased effort and involves training on the RDA Toolkit as a product as well as the cataloging rules themselves. In organizing the training, timing will be crucial. We here did not want to do training so far in advance that by the time RDA was being applied, training was forgotten. We started our training program by outlining some of the major differences between RDA and AACR2 as a way to frame the main conceptual differences between the two cataloging codes. We didn't talk about policies or procedures, just the effects that the differences might have on the data that we were producing or using. And I would say that in retrospect, this approach worked quite well for us, and we did it very, very early on, actually, right after midwinter, kind of in the spring, well before RDA was even released, as a kind of way to preview what we knew was coming. And I think it helped also the technical services managers and administrators to start thinking about how to frame the implementation of RDA, and it also gave the most basic introduction to RDA to staff who hadn't been involved in following the development of the code in the same way that a lot of our original catalogers had. We also thought it would be best to integrate local policy decisions when we did training on RDA. So we actually reused LC's video recordings of the Train the Trainer session as a main basis for local, more in-depth training as kind of a lower barrier way for us to organize the training. We didn't have to develop our own training modules from scratch, but we could concentrate more of our efforts not on just representing what had already been well presented by LC, but instead on integrating into that more of our local policies and practices that we were going to be adopting. For the toolkit, we actually just used a lot of the webinars that ALA had already done, ALA Publishing had done to demonstrate the workings of the toolkit. We created some workflows in the toolkit so that people could kind of go in and mess around with those and learn how to navigate. And managers in the department kind of supplemented the existing webinar training with local demonstrations on navigation as well as how to get from the toolkit to Cataloger's desktop, etc. And in retrospect, I think we would probably do it exactly the same way. Finally, we need to provide training on how staff will encode the data that they're using in the rules. At this stage, this is actually probably the easier aspect of training and implementing RDA. The new RDA fields that have been added to the MARC bibliographic and authority and holdings formats and also to OCLC connection really are, they're relatively few. Non-MARC metadata like Dublin Core presents some different challenges because of course there's no RDA elements in Dublin Core. So one of the issues the testing community will be assessing is the ability for RDA data to conform to encoding outside of a MARC-based environment and vice versa. But for the vast majority of most of our institutions' metadata production, which is currently MARC, the shift will not present a significant barrier to training on how to encode RDA metadata. Every organization is going to have different operational demands, different organizational structures, levels of staffing, existing knowledge of RDA, administrative support, which may range from total support to partial support to skeptical support, and at this stage perhaps even no support at all. So how will administrators choose to address developing institutional policies on implementation? Will cataloging and technical services managers establish policies on their own? Will a subset of managers and original catalogers do this work, or will everyone share in the process? There is no one right approach, and administrators will need to choose their direction based on local needs and abilities. Developing policies on anything requires investment of time and human resources. At Chicago, where original catalogers had been actively following developments in FRBR and RDA for a number of years, there was a desire for everyone to kind of take that and roll with it and have everyone share equally in the process of developing our initial institutional policies. So we started meeting regularly after January 2010. We established kind of outlines of tasks that would need to be done, setting timelines, identifying staff outside of the cataloging units who would also have a stake in setting various policies. For example, what would our interaction and collaboration be with our systems department, our acquisition staff, and for the display of RDA metadata in particular, public services staff would also need to be involved. RDA contains a number of core or mandatory elements, and making decisions on core elements will certainly be something that all administrators will need to address to one degree or another. Institutions will need to decide whether, in addition to those that are already defined as core elements in RDA, are there others that you would consider core for your institution's bibliographic and authority records, or alternatively, whether all non-core elements would simply be applied using cataloger's judgment. In this slide, I've linked first to the document that outlines the Library of Congress's decisions on what would be considered LC core for the purposes of specifically the Library of Congress's test period. And at Chicago, we have a much smaller list of elements that we're going to consider core, 5 or 6 others, and we kept it relatively simple. RDA also contains a number of instances of options or alternatives where a cataloger can apply local policies or his or her own judgment in applying one or more options outlined in the text of a given RDA rule. Identifying all of the options in the text of RDA for us would have taken an extraordinary amount of time and effort because they're really kind of scattered throughout. And so we actually chose to wait and cheat a little and wait for the Library of Congress to release its own decisions, really for a couple of reasons. First, we knew ELSI would do the hard work for us. They would identify all of the areas in the code that have options, and that we could then just go through that list and either agree with their policy or choose a different path for ourselves. And we didn't have to start that from scratch, and it worked quite well. We did it very quickly. Secondly, we are a PCC institution contributing to BIBCO, CONSER, NACO, and SACO, so we already have a close alignment with ELSI policies, and managers at other institutions might want to choose a different implementation path and maybe just apply cataloger's judgment to everything that isn't already core, and that's perfectly fine. Certainly, I think that would be an attractive option for administrators at smaller institutions with fewer catalogers, where keeping track of what you're doing might be a little bit more challenging because your staff are probably taking on multiple roles than just cataloging. But we chose to develop our initial policies for the test prior to providing the staff training because we really, again, we wanted to integrate not just the general, this is RDA kind of training topics, but also this is RDA and this is how we are going to apply RDA, at least during the test period. About a month ago in the ALCTS e-forum, which was called Preparing Your Library for RDA, Mary Beth Weber and I posed some questions to participants about how they would be preparing their ILS systems, their discovery layers, or faceted browsers for RDA records. And what became clear in that e-forum was the variant level of control that institutions have over their systems, with some having a lot of local ability, both technically and in terms of their staff expertise, to configure and reconfigure their ILS, to other institutions who have almost no local control and being really almost totally dependent on the vendor to push out updates or changes to their systems. So when you are starting to think about implementation, whether it's now or next year, you will want to consult documentation your ILS vendor has distributed with regard to its readiness for RDA. You'll certainly want, if they have made changes, to make sure you have the most current version of the system loaded. You may also want to contact testers who have the same ILS to see how they have handled the shift at their institutions. Systems administrators who may not be catalogers are still going to require at least some knowledge of what new data will be contained in RDA MARC records, at least enough to know what will need to be done in the local system to accommodate the data. And so that's really our responsibility as cataloging managers, is to make sure that we're communicating the new needs to people who aren't as closely tied to it as perhaps we are. I think there are really two main areas where administrators are going to initially be focusing their attention, and it's on things that kind of look different in the RDA records. The first is the suite of new or modified fields in the MARC bibliographic and authority formats, and the second is an increased emphasis that I think you will see in RDA records that use relationship designators or relator terms and codes for entities related to the resource being described. And we have used these for a long time. I think we're just going to start using them A, more, and B, in different contexts. The document that I linked to on this slide was prepared by Sally McCallum at the Library of Congress, and it outlines all of the changes that have been made to the MARC bibliographic authorities and holdings formats to accommodate RDA. There is a spectrum of changes outlined in this document, from making some of the existing MARC subfields repeatable to establishing altogether new MARC fields. And we could probably spend an entire webinar just on this, but let's focus on bibliographic fields for a second, because I think that this has the potential for what users will see the most. And these are probably the fields most people listening have heard of most often. One of the more noticeable differences between AACR2 and RDA is that in RDA, there's no longer a GMD, no longer 245 subfield H's like electronic resource or microform in square brackets following the title. Instead, there will be 3 new elements, content type, media type, and carrier type, encoded in 336, 337, and 338 fields, respectively. And the bookends on here, the content type and the carrier type, are both RDA core elements. And I've given some examples of some of the data that you might end up seeing in these fields. This is a screenshot of the University of Chicago's Horizon ILS catalog interface, where for a long time we've had a format column that displays GMDs when a 245H is present in the record. So when we look up the title, Regional Database Central Asia, in Chicago's Horizon catalog, which shows up as the 3rd entry in this result set, it no longer has electronic resource in the format column. This is a record we converted to RDA. And it would have had that under ASCR2 cataloging. And you can see electronic resource in the title right before it, but not for ours. One of the things all institutions will need to decide is how you want to integrate RDA records with ASCR2 records. And this is just one example of the decisions that you're going to need to make. In the case of GMDs, there are a number of options, and I've heard of a number of options on the LXE forum and in communication between the testing institutions. Are you going to substitute GMD with one of the RDA elements, for example, like the media type or the carrier type? Are you going to remove GMDs from display for everything in the catalog altogether? And in fact, there are some catalog interfaces already where GMDs don't display. Will you do nothing at all and let existing GMDs display as they always have, and do absolutely nothing to kind of GMDify your RDA records? And again, there's no one right answer, and every institution will need to weigh its own pros and cons on its own. When we look at the full record display for the same title, Regional Database Central Asia in the Horizon catalog, you can see that the content type, media type, and carrier type initially, this is a screenshot from quite a while ago, naturally displayed under the description label in the catalog because they were part of the 3XX suite of fields, and that's where they just kind of went in. And they had no really field-specific labels or context because we hadn't given them any, and so they just kind of hang there without context. As I said, some institutions, both in the test and outside of the test, probably are not displaying them at all. They're instead relying on things like fixed field coding in the leader or the 007 to define and drive refinements on facets or format codes. So, but other institutions are displaying them. Some of the institutions in the test are displaying these fields with the exact same terminology that their element name is in RDA. Locally, our public services staff initially didn't want them to display at all, but for the purposes of the test, we ultimately did decide to display them, but public services didn't like the RDA terminology, so they renamed them. So this is actually a screenshot, not of Horizon, but of Aqua Browser. And how they show up in Aqua Browser, which is our faceted discovery layer. So I have highlighted on this screen the 336, 337, and 338 fields, and the display labels that public services managers gave to those new fields. But in truth, I expect this will be a relatively short-lived solution. There is a strong desire to investigate whether and how the existing fields could do an adequate job already of faceting, and whether the new fields are useful at all in that regard. But because of other demands, this probably won't we won't start work on this for another couple of months. And ultimately, what we do doesn't matter to the majority of you listening. I just mentioned this as an issue that you may also need to address in some fashion or another. And it will likely result in a collaborative effort between cataloging staff who understand the data and system staff who understand what is possible technically, and public services staff who will want to influence things like the displays to the public. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides. I'm watching the time, and I'm going to skip through them, but I'm going to also nevertheless include them in the PowerPoint slides that go out to everyone, and the kind of text of what I was going to say about some of these examples will also be included in the PowerPoint slides, so you won't miss anything. But I just have some other examples in here of display issues that you may need to think about at your institution. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and go to authority control. What will you in your cataloger see in authority records for the time being? During the test period, and I think there's been a lot of listserv buzz about what the effect of on authorities will be. During the test period, the 1XX field in AACR2 authority records will not be changed to the RDA form. The RDA form will be given in a 7XX field with the second indicator of 4, even if the RDA form is unchanged from the AACR2 form. And why is that? Well, I think ultimately the presence of the 7XX field will probably serve as a way for us to identify which records are different, which records will need to have headings flipped, but it's also an indication that an original cataloger in the national test has already reviewed the authority record and the structure of the record and the structure of the access points. There's also a number of new fields in authority records, largely to accommodate personal name access points for musical works, and it's largely hoped that the addition of these new data will help developing efforts to make library data live and contribute to the semantic web. Again, this is an area where institutions that do not create or edit authorities will need to make policy decisions on how much effort to invest in contributing these data. And PCC has issued some of its own guidelines on the ramifications of the RDA test on PCC cataloging that I linked to in the slide. Certainly administrators at PCC institutions, particularly those I think that don't have a lot of representation on some of the PCC steering or policy committees, will want to watch very closely and perhaps find their own ways to influence how PCC manages the transition to RDA. And the document I linked to outlines some of the following areas that PCC expects to be informed itself by the process. Will PCC adopt RDA as a new standard? Will PCC accept records based on both AACR2 and RDA? If PCC adopts RDA, will there be PCC decisions on additional core elements or options? If PCC adopts a set of decisions for options and alternatives, will such decisions be displayed in the RDA Toolkit, for example? Just like LCRIs or the successor to LCRIs, the LC policy statements do. And if PCC allows contributions of both AACR2 and RDA records, and if LC implements RDA, who will maintain AACR2 documentation? It's a very good question. Vended processes and products. This is again an area that I'm sorry I have few answers, but can help frame some of the questions that all of us will need to address at some point. If RDA is adopted, there will be significant changes to some authority structures, a large one being Bible headings that we've heard about quite a lot. In AACR2, Old Testament was abbreviated as OT, and New Testament was NT, but in RDA they'll be fully spelled out. And individual books of the Bible will now be directly entered under Bible instead of Bible Old Testament or Bible New Testament. This change alone will eventually result in significant batch changes to the name and subject authority files, but it's really just one example. Backstage Library Works is one of the vendors in the national test, and it will be interesting to see what effects RDA will have on vended authorities processing, probably not in the immediate sense, but maybe a year from now. Library Technologies, Inc., LTI, and other major authorities vendor recently issued a statement really to the same effect, that until formal decisions are made on adoption, LTI has no plans to alter the way it manages its authorities processing. Administrators will also need to consider the effects down the road of MARC records we are purchasing from vendors and contract cataloging that our institution outsources. It is unlikely that most vendors will move to RDA production themselves before the National Libraries formally adopt RDA. And they probably won't do it until there's a market demand for them to do it. So again, this is probably not something we're going to think about in the immediate sense, but perhaps later next year, if there is adoption, we will all be thinking about what the impact on our vendors will be and what we expect vendors to do in their own transition to in their products and their services. If your library moves to RDA, will you expect your vendors to do the same? And on what timeline? No doubt there will be a lengthy period of time when we are creating, acquiring, ingesting, and managing a combination of ACR2 and RDA data. But if we are going to adopt, there will be kind of snowball effects on the criteria that we use to establish quality with our vendors. We may even need to be doing entirely new contracts for contract cataloging because our requirements will be quite different. Shifting gears, I wanted to touch a little on acquisitions and copy cataloging because I think that will require similar levels of administrative decisions at all of our institutions. Whether you're implementing RDA or not, the fact is there's going to be RDA master records, and what will your libraries be doing when you're ingesting and importing those? And so I have linked to the OCLC policy statement on what we're allowed to do in OCLC and what the guidelines are, based largely on encoding levels and a principle that we not duplicate records in different that are cataloged according to different rules. A lot of our institutions also have kind of fast cat or quick cat procedures where acquisition starts and finishes cataloging if the quality criteria is met. And locally we had a lot of discussion about will RDA affect that criteria at all. And so for the time being we have kind of filtered out through our own ingest filters any record that comes in that's RDA. It will go to an original cataloger for review, but I hope that that will be relatively short-lived. With copy cataloging, all of our copy catalogers have attended the training, so have all of the acquisitions managers, and they've done exercises, but it may be some time before we know exactly how dramatic the shift will be for copy cataloging because, of course, they have to have something to copy catalog. So this is going to be one of the moving targets, as it were. Bottom line, costs. Administrators are going to want to know what the costs are of implementing RDA. The cost of the online toolkit is based on a sliding scale of the number of users at your institution. ALA Publishing has also recently released pricing and ordering information for institutions who want to buy it in print. And their plan is to distribute updates by PDF files, and some of those will be free and some might not be free. And then we're going to have to integrate those into the print product like we did with ACR2. In all cases, purchasing the print will, when you look at the prices, will seem like the least expensive option. But over time, it's not. We have no idea what the cost will be because we don't know what the cost of the updates will be. It's likewise difficult to judge what the opportunity costs are going to be of not subscribing to the online toolkit. For instance, the print version won't contain links between related rules or rules in the Library of Congress policy statements, which is the successor to LCRIs. And the print version obviously won't be accessible through Cataloger's desktop. In terms of overall costs of implementing RDA, especially those related to staffing, it's difficult to imagine that they would be anything but relative to all of our institutions, and many of the costs would be intangible. But administrators should also realize that metadata is a living thing. It was never an intent to adopt ACR2 in perpetuity and never move away from it. In every profession, standards are always changing, and we need to keep up with them and respond to those changes as well. To some degree, the formal testers are incurring a little bit of the brunt of the costs right now because we are not just implementing RDA, we are managing pre-testing, organization, and planning, and ensuring that everyone understands the testing requirements, conducting user testing, and perhaps most time-consuming of all, we're creating all of the surveys that accompany all of the RDA records. It's my hope that the investment that all of our testing institutions are making now will hopefully help curb the costs at other institutions down the road when you can learn from our experiences, maybe share our training materials and share our policies if they meet your needs as well. This is a link to some of the important resources that I think you might want to look at for training. At the end, I've given a link to the North Carolina State RDA testing site, which I think is just a spectacular page that outlines North Carolina's approach to managing the test and managing policy development. And there are some presentations, particularly by Adam Schiff and by Bob Maxwell on the JSC's website that you can get off of that link there. I'm going to close. I see we have very little time for questions, so I'm going to close with two quotes, one from my boss, the Director of Libraries, Judy Nadler, who co-authored a chapter of a book in 1986 that outlined AACR2 implementation experiences all across the country. And thinking back on how they had handled AACR2 implementation a few years before that, the authors wrote, "Choices made in planning the AACR2 implementation process were guided by the principles of feasibility and merit. Feasibility from the standpoint of minimizing disruption to catalog users. Were we to do this again, the principles would still be the basis of planning and implementation." And I think this is precisely how we are, all this time later, approaching the testing process for RDA. But in addition to disruption to the users, we are also hoping that the process will help maximize the use and the benefits of the metadata. And the last quote is a phrase that I heard last June at RLG, the Research Libraries Group annual conference, and it kind of stuck with me. Unfortunately, I can't remember who said it, and I did a Google search for it. And on Google, it says it's in the war room of the headquarters of the Ford Motor Company. But that's as close as I will get to relating libraries, again, to the auto industry. But it does resonate. If we want to facilitate any kind of change in an organization, no matter what it is, we sometimes need to focus on culture and not what we are wanting to change. With respect to RDA, the culture we are presently in is heavily influenced by ACR2 and MARC, and we have not changed those much over time. Moving forward with a cataloging code that is issued primarily as an electronic resource, it's my hope that the testing process will result in changes to how our profession has built a culture around developing rules. As we identify areas where RDA can be improved, I think the JSC will be challenged to adopt strategies that will promote a cataloging code that is truly living, that is flexible, and that can be modified speedily. Likewise, at the local level, we could do all of the strategic planning and the training and the prep that we want, but it won't really amount to much if there isn't organizational support from up and down administrators to across our staff lines. So thank you, and I think I'm putting it over to Diane for questions now.
And we have very little time for questions, I'm afraid. So let me just do the official closing, and then I'll tell you what some of the major question categories were. And Chris, I'm hoping that you will write answers to the questions after.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you so much for giving us your perspective on preparing for RDA. I do want everyone to see that we have webinars coming up in November and December as part of this RDA series, and we are discounting if you register for multiple webinars. There's also another group coming in the new year, and you'll be seeing publicity about them in a couple of months. So please stay with us, and over the course of this year we hope to cover all of the RDA issues that might occur to you. And of course, the ALCTS website is your source of announcements for all of our continuing education events. You are going to receive an evaluation form from ALCTS, and please respond. We really value your input and your suggestions. Someone asked again about the recording of this. Yes, the entire webinar is recorded, and you will receive Chris's PowerPoint presentation and a link to the recording, and that will come to you shortly, so that you can listen again, especially for those of you who may have had some sound issues. As far as the questions go, I'll just tell you the general categories because we really are almost out of time. There were several questions about how much time it took for you to train your staff, Chris, and also training time and also experimenting time. Do you want to address that one?
Training, I think it's going to be very different for copy catalogers as it is for original catalogers. I have to say we're very lucky that the original catalogers across the organization actually have been following RDA forever. We were contributing responses to drafts of RDA as early back as 2006 and 2008. And actually our original catalogers had attended some of the JSC meetings. And so we didn't have as big a learning curve. I think we probably spent about 3 or 4 days total, I would say, in kind of collaborative all together in a room kind of thing. For the copy catalogers, I think it's going to be more staged approach where the policies are going to have to be developed, or the procedures rather, are going to have to be developed and be much more explicit and directional as opposed to the theoretical, because you know, they've got different demands on their time. So they attended all of the training, they did all of the same exercises, they were in a room with all of the original catalogers who helped frame questions and answers, but I think ultimately it's going to be a different experience training copy catalogers.
And one related question is the presence of RDA records in OCLC. How will people recognize them?
All RDA records in OCLC will have an 040 subfield E with RDA in it, and that is the main indicator that it is an RDA record, 040 subfield E RDA. And you can do a search in the command line in OCLC that is, I believe it's DX:RDA, and that will bring up all records that are cataloged according to RDA rules.
And can you confirm, Chris, that you are going to provide the PowerPoint as well as your talking points?
The notes are in the PowerPoint slides, just in the regular notes section, and it's basically, that's all laid out there, including some of the slides that we didn't look at.
Perfect. That was one of the questions.
Yeah, that's all right.
Great. I can see that we are out of time. The remaining questions will come to you via email with Chris's answers. I want to thank Geneva Chambly for being our technical support. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing other topics with you in the future. Have an excellent day.